What's up guys, it's Nav here. So it's been a while now since I've really done anything with invention, more or less dating back to last year when I actually unlocked the skill in August, and then in September when I threw together a few pretty basic Gizmo perks on my tier 80 armor to help with starting to kill Araxi, mainly being for Venom Blood. And since then, I've obviously leveled the skill to 120 simply by siphoning and augmenting gear leveled in combat, but outside of that I really haven't done anything involving Gizmo perks, so I thought I've probably put it off for long enough and I should finally look at investing time into putting something worthwhile on both my tier 80 armor sets and my tier 90 weapons. So the perks to choose weren't obvious to me, although I wasn't considering a number of perks involving very high level components, such as the Noxious components from Noxious weapons, Zaros components from the tier 80 next armors, or Rumbling components from a variety of tier 90 weapons and armors. Now, I more or less couldn't find any decent information for Ironman about this topic, only topics aimed at standard accounts, which obviously doesn't take into consideration the limitation of being an Ironman, so I kind of just gathered ideas based off of multiple sources of information and came up with a list of perks which I was going to attempt to make for my tier 90 weapons and tier 80 armors. So with my choices, a lot of them are just my opinion and honestly what seemed to be best to me, based off of how they read and what other people were saying about them. Although when it came down to it, the Gizmos with Biting 2 and Venom Blood, and also Crackling 3 and Mobile, were rather flexible, as the main perk I was after was Biting 2 and also Crackling 3. There were various combinations you could make along with these to get various other effects, such as Genocidal, Demon, Dragon and Undead Slayer, and so on, but I went with the two that best suited my type of play, which is more or less only bossing. But point being, you could definitely go with something else if you would prefer. But in terms of the rest, I more or less felt they were the best perks available to any Ironman who aren't doing the top end bosses and also have loot from those bosses to disassemble. So unfortunately, I didn't just have all of these components lying around, more or less not having any of the spare components that were specifically from bosses, such as Samrock, Armadillo, or Ilujankin components. And going forward, I'm just going to refer to Ilujankin as Ilu components. They come from Dragon Rider Lancers and Zaros gear, which is specifically from Vindicta. So starting with the simplest thing first, I wanted to farm explosive components. These are required to make the Crackling perk and are pretty easy to farm in bulk through hand cannons at the Chaos Dwarf battlefield. So at my time there, I did not get any Dragon pickaxe drops, but it didn't take me any longer than around an hour and a half, and I did have 5 hand cannons, which, giving 7 explosive components each, I felt would probably be enough to move on. Next, I was after Samrock Components. Now these are needed to make the Impatient 3 perk, and as suggested in the name, they come from Samrock gear, specifically tier 70 Subjugation, and also Samrock Warpriest gear. So I did go with killing Krill, although if you aren't into bossing, it's quite possible to farm the minions outside of the boss room specifically for Samrock Warpriest gear. Though since I quite outgear God Wars Dungeon 1, I was more than happy to just kill the boss, and of course any chance to getting a boss pet is always welcome. So I was just disassembling the Warpriest the moment I was getting it, simply because those are unique items you can only have one of at a time, so I wanted to free up the ability to get those items as a drop again. Unlike the Subjugation armor, which I was holding onto because I wanted to be able to augment the chest and leg drops and level them to at least level 9 first, meaning they would give quadruple components upon disassembling. So after roughly 7 hours at Samrock, I had managed 14 drops of either Subjugation or Warpriest gear, along with Godsword shards and 2 effigies, so I decided that would probably do and it was time to move on. Now the next component I was after was Armadillo components, so this is needed to make the Precise perk in the Equilibrium 2 and Precise 4 Gizmo. So just like Samrock components, these come from God Wars Dungeon 1, specifically the Armadillo and Warpiece drops from Kriera. So unfortunately, not as lucky at Kree, only managing 4 Armadillo drops over 4 hours, but regardless, only 1 Armadillo component was needed per Gizmo, so I wasn't too worried and decided to move on. Now, it was at this point that I decided to stock up on Divine Charges, so over time I have been collecting incandescent energies, and I did amass a total of 1.3 million incandescent energies, which I do hope keeps me stocked up for quite some time. And because of the kingdom, I do always have a decent stock of maple logs to disassemble into simple components. And after some time I did finally disassemble all of my maple logs and turn those into divine charges, running out of simple parts at 1,320 divine charges, with 991,000 incandescent energies, which I was more or less happy with. That should be enough divine charges to keep me going for quite some time, and my kingdom will eventually produce enough logs to turn the remaining energies into charges as well. So next I was after Illu components for the perk Aftershock 3, which as previously stated comes from Dragon Rider Lances and Zaros armor from Vindicta. Now this perk was probably the one I was most unsure of, simply because of the requirement to disassemble such high level equipment, and the fact that farming this boss will be quite slower than the previous God Wars Dungeon 1 bosses, so I certainly didn't expect to be able to pick up these components as easily. So my first 6 hours of Vindicta wasn't so exciting, just getting the usual unwanted drops, but I did manage to hit 1 billion total XP, which although irrelevant was kind of a cool feat to reach on my Ironman. And eventually I did manage to have a nice stroke of luck, as within the following 5 hours I did manage to get 2 Crests of Zaros, which I was extremely happy with, as I did expect to have to spend more than 11 hours farming this boss. Now, along with those 2 Zaros crests, I did also have essences from previous God Wars Dungeon 2 experiences, along with my Dragon Rider Lance that I've had since August of last year when I did farm a full set of Zaros gear, and also an additional Zaros crest, which I don't have a recording of anymore, as I did get it late last year when I spent roughly an hour killing Vindicta with a friend, which is pretty much something I never do, but regardless it did mean I did have enough Illu components and I was done. And of course, there were other components needed for some of these gizmos, but fortunately I had managed to get a decent amount of each of these indirectly when disassembling level 10 gear, or items I crafted, or even items I was buying from shops. So the next step was to augment all of the chest and leg pieces I planned on disassembling, as getting that to level 9 will give quadruple components, and also just getting it to level 10 will give the maximum amount of invention experience possible, so that was the plan. Now I did just do something really bad, which was really easy to miss, so I'm just going to play that back a bit. So that's right, I did manage to destroy my original set of Zaros armor. Now this was due to an intricate set of mistakes that I made in the minutes before this happened, which I will try to briefly explain. So first off, as I previously mentioned, I had these essences. Now as I was heading to the Invention Guild, I did quickly look up Refined Anima Core and ended up looking at one of the helmets, which stated I only needed 1 essence of each type to upgrade the tier 80 gear to the degradable tier 85 gear, which can then be augmented and dismantled while still giving back the tier 80 piece of gear it was originally made from. Now at the time I didn't realize I was looking at a helmet which is different, with the chest and legs requiring more than 1 essence. Although I didn't find that too strange considering it's 1 crest to upgrade the gear to tier 80 to begin with, so it didn't seem that weird at the moment of reading it. So due to that I thought, great, now I can unaugment my current Zaros gear and upgrade both pieces to tier 85 and dismantle those along with everything else to get all the components at once. So because of that I needed to take off the current augments they had, which after going to make I realized I needed vials, so I ran back to the bank, grabbed those vials, and then I made what I thought was augment dissolvers, which in fact ended up being equipment dissolvers that instead saved the gizmos and destroyed the gear. And at the time I didn't even realize upon running back to the invention table that it had switched from augment dissolvers to equipment ones. And for anyone wondering how I didn't notice that at all, honestly, those were items I've pretty much never used on my Ironman and barely used on my main years ago, and I didn't even pay attention to the warning boxes, as honestly, warning boxes pop up a lot in this game, and most of the time they don't really mean anything, and I was more or less thinking about what I was planning on doing in the future rather than at the immediate moment. So yeah, that happened, and honestly, I wasn't angry, just really sad and disappointed in myself for doing something that stupid.
Oh no. Did I just destroy gear? I did, didn't I? No. No. No, why did I just destroy that? Whoa. Fuck. That is not a good deal. I'm not happy about that at all.
But nevertheless, I wasn't going to give up there, so that meant it was time to head back to God Wars Dungeon 2. Now, I would have loved it if I did get another 2 Zaris crests in 11 hours like before, but I did not have such luck. Although around 8 hours I did manage my first real drop, which unfortunately was not a crest of Zaris or a lance, but in fact the Shimmering Scale, which is the pet drop that has the model of Gorvek the Dragon. So that was pretty cool, meaning I actually only needed to get a Dragon Rider lance for the bossing title. Sadly, my current Dragon Rider lance was a drop from before the collection tab update, so it does not actually count. And from that point, I did go roughly another 12 hours with nothing apart from dormant gear drops and also a few essences, neither actually being needed, until I finally managed to drop a crest of Zaros. Now, despite the fact I destroyed 2 pieces of my Zaros gear, this was sufficient, as originally I actually had enough to have a few components to spare, just in case, so luckily with that 1 crest alone I was able to finish with this boss and get back on track with making these gizmos. So of course I did still need to go ahead and now level all of this augment gear to level 10, though this was pretty easy and done AFKing at my favourite place, the Hellhound Resource Dungeon. And with all of those pieces of gear leveled, I was able to disassemble it all, although now taking a lot more care. I did also augment a few extra items which I had in my bank previously, as considering there's now a collection tab, I'm not as bothered with hoarding things such as God Wars Dungeon 1 armor and weapons that are never going to be used otherwise. In this process of disassembling everything, I did also manage to go from around 149 million to 157 million Invention XP, which I do plan on pushing to 200 mil at some point soon, simply for the fun of getting a 200 mil on my Ironman. And with all of that out of the way, I was finally able to get into making these gizmos. So starting off with the weapon gizmo, I started off by going for Equilibrium 2 and Precise 4. So obviously these will vary in what level they are, and therefore how good they are, so I did continue to make gizmos until I completely ran out of Armadillo components, in an attempt to get the best gizmos possible. Now in that process I did luckily get at least 1 perfect gizmo, Equilibrium 2 and Precise 4, with the best other 2 being 1 Equilibrium 1 and Precise 4, and the other being Equilibrium 1 and Precise 3, and that was over 27 attempts worth. So I'm certainly glad I threw all of my extra Armadillo armor into this to increase my odds. Next with the other weapon gizmo, which was Aftershock 3 from the Illu Components. Now going into it, I wasn't 100% sure if it was going to be guaranteed Aftershock 3, but luckily it was, and I was able to pick up my 3 Aftershock 3s and was completely done with my weapon gizmos, which overall I'm pretty happy with. And for those wondering, I do plan on putting the best Gizmo Equilibrium 2 and Precise 4 gizmo onto my Noxious Staff, as magic is my favourite combat style to use casually, and I do want to use it specifically when learning how to Telos, so that made that decision pretty easy. Next was the armor gizmos, which I was hoping would be a lot more straightforward, considering most of the perks I'm aiming for are from components that I have plenty of just through progressing invention over time. So starting off I was going for Impatient 3, which was the perk requiring Samrock Components. So just like with the Armadillo components, I had stocked up on many, starting with 42 Samrock components, and within 4 attempts, 3 of those did give me what I was after, so it was nice to be able to get that out of the way without much trouble. Next I was after Enhanced Devoted 3. Now this is another one of those perks that could have probably been swapped out for a standard Devoted perk paired with something else, but personally I love the benefit it provides pretty much more than anything else I could have gotten otherwise. But if you don't do much content where you are using overhead protection prayers, it could easily be swapped out. Now I did have another bump in the road. When researching what perks, I obviously planned on putting 4 different things on my armor gizmos on each set of armor, but when I was at this point I noticed the 2 slots stated next to the perk. Now this confused me since other perks which are by themselves, such as Impatient 3, don't state that, so immediately I assumed I somehow missed the fact and it in fact would take up both gizmo slots on a piece of armor. So at that immediate moment, I got the impression I would have to scratch my 4th gizmo that I had planned, Crackling 3 and Mobile. But outside of getting more confused than I already was, it only did take 5 attempts to get my 3 enhanced devoted 3s. So next moving on to Biting 2 and Venom Blood. So as previously said, I just went through this because Biting is the essential perk and Venom Blood is situationally quite powerful on certain bosses. Fortunately this perk was relatively easy to make, only requiring uncommon components that I had plenty of. And after 35 attempts, I did get my 3 Biting 2s and Venom Blood, so I was quite happy, and at that point I thought I was done, as it wasn't until after I put all my gizmos in and thought about it for a bit that I did actually realise I could in fact have enhanced devoted with another gizmo on the same piece of gear. So that did mean Crackling 3 and Mobile was back in, so I did have 37 explosive components, totaling 9 attempts at going for this combination of perks. Although unfortunately, after all my attempts, I didn't actually get anything close to that, with my best options being 1 Crackling 3 and Ultimatums 2, along with 2 slightly worse, Crackling 2 and Ultimatums 2. So not bad. Ultimatums isn't necessarily a bad perk, but the skills it does benefit is very limited to a few ultimates that I personally never use, so I wasn't too bothered about it, but regardless, I'm still going to use it for the Crackling alone. And with that final gizmo put in, I am done, and although I certainly didn't make it easy on myself, I'm still really glad I went ahead with it and got all of my gear perked up. So that's pretty much it for this one. To be honest, I didn't intend on this being such a long video or it taking me a week to do, but obviously things didn't go exactly as planned. And of course, if you guys want to share your opinions on decent perks for Ironman that differ to the ones I went with, the feedback is welcomed, considering at some point in the future I'll most likely end up with better gear and needing to go through with this process again. But that is it for me. Thanks for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.